day Marcus Elliott slid that consultant's report across the conference table and told me my methods were outdated, I did something I'd learned a long time ago in 22 years of supply chain work. I kept my face completely still and said, "I appreciate the feedback." He was 31 years old. He'd been with the company 11 months. His LinkedIn said he'd optimized procurement strategies at 2 startups that no longer existed. I'd been keeping Hargrove Logistics alive since before he graduated college. My name is Daniel Reeves. I'm 53 years old, and until that Tuesday afternoon in October, I was the most reliable operations director Hargrove had ever had. Not the loudest, not the one whose name showed up in press releases, but the one who made sure $24 million worth of hospital supply contracts ran without a single missed delivery in 6 years. The one the warehouse floor called first when something went wrong at 2 a.m. The one who knew exactly which vendor would quietly expedite a shipment on a holiday weekend, if you asked the right way. I came to Hargrove after my wife Carol was diagnosed with MS. She was 44. Our daughter Megan was in her junior year of high school. I needed benefits that were ironclad, a schedule I could depend on, and a company close enough to home that I could get to Carol's appointments without burning personal days every week. Before that, I'd spent 15 years in military logistics, Army, not Navy, so nobody in the comments section can come for me. Managing supply chains for forward operating bases in places where, if the wrong thing arrived late, people didn't just get inconvenienced. They died. That mindset followed me into civilian work. You don't let things slip. You document everything. You build redundancy into every process because the moment you assume something will hold, that's the moment it doesn't. When I joined Hargrove, the operations department was a mess held together by 3 people's tribal knowledge and a shared spreadsheet that crashed every time 2 people opened it simultaneously. The previous director had retired without leaving a single written procedure behind. Clients were frustrated. 2 hospital networks were threatening to take their contracts to a competitor. The CEO, Robert Hargrove, founder, 67 years old, old school handshake kind of man, hired me specifically to stabilize things. I spent my first 8 months rebuilding every process from scratch. I came in at 6 every morning, stayed until the floor cleared out, and on weekends, I sat at my kitchen table building out a vendor relationship database, so detailed that my daughter once asked if I was writing a novel. In a way, I was. A very boring, very important novel about lead times and backup suppliers and compliance documentation that would eventually save the company 3 times over. The St. Vincent Health contract was the crown jewel. 12 hospitals across 4 states, $24 million annually, covering everything from surgical gloves to IV equipment. I'd built that relationship personally, knew their procurement director, Janet Ochoa, well enough to have met her husband at a conference dinner. When their requirements changed, and hospital supply requirements change constantly, I was the one who adjusted our systems before they had to ask twice. Janet had told Robert directly that Hargrove's reliability was the only reason they hadn't moved to a national distributor. Robert knew this. He also knew that I knew it. What Robert didn't account for was his son-in-law. Marcus Elliott married Robert's daughter Priya 2 years before he joined the company. He had an MBA from a school I describe as aggressively mediocre and a confidence level I describe as aggressively unearned. Robert gave him a VP title and a mandate to modernize operations. What that meant in practice was Marcus attending meetings asking questions he could have answered by reading our existing documentation, and eventually commissioning a consulting report from a firm that charged $40,000 to tell us things I'd written in internal memos 2 years earlier. I'd offered to sit down with Marcus 3 times in his first year, walk him through our systems, show him how everything connected. Each time he canceled. Too busy, he said. I understood. He had slides to make. The October meeting was supposed to be a quarterly review. Robert was there, Marcus was there, and so was Diane Walsh, our CFO, who had the expression of someone watching a car slowly roll toward a ditch. Marcus presented the consulting report with the enthusiasm of someone who'd confused it for his own work. The headline recommendation: digitize our vendor management system using a platform I'd already evaluated 18 months earlier and rejected because it couldn't handle the compliance documentation requirements for medical-grade supply chains. When I pointed this out, quietly and with specifics, Marcus smiled the way people smile when they've decided to stop listening. "Daniel, I think you've done great work maintaining the legacy systems," he said. "But we're looking at scaling, and that requires a different kind of thinking." Different kind of thinking. I was 53 years old. I had built the system he was calling Legacy. I had documentation folders named after his predecessor's predecessor. Robert looked at his notepad. Diane looked at the window. After the meeting, Marcus asked me to stay behind. He had the good grace to wait until the room cleared before he said it. I've talked to Robert about restructuring the ops team. We think it's time to bring in some fresh leadership. We'd like to move you into a senior advisor role. Senior advisor. The corporate retirement party you don't get a cake for. I asked what that would mean for my responsibilities. He said I'd be available for consultation, while a new director was brought in to implement the modernization plan. The salary would stay the same for a 12-month transition period. After that, it would be reassessed. I said I understood. I thanked him for telling me directly. I drove home that night and sat in the driveway for 20 minutes. Carol was inside. She'd had a bad week. Her fatigue had been worse. She'd missed 2 days of the part-time job she'd kept for her own sanity. And the last thing she needed was me walking in, looking the way I felt. So I sat there until my face settled. Then I went inside and made dinner, and didn't say a word about it. That night, while Carol slept, I sat at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad, and I thought very carefully about my options. I was an at-will employee. There was no severance protection written into my contract. The senior advisor offer was legal. Walking out immediately was legal. What was also completely, entirely, unimpeachably legal was showing up every single day and doing precisely the job I'd been officially given, no more, no less, until further notice. I'd spent 2 decades in military logistics. I understood something about working within the exact parameters of your orders. The next morning, I arrived at 8 o'clock, not 7, not 6:30, 8, which was what my contract said. I went to my desk, opened my email, and answered messages that were explicitly addressed to me when Marcus forwarded me something from the St. Like Vincent procurement team with a note saying, "Can you loop in?" I replied that I'd be happy to assist once I had a clear picture of my current scope of responsibilities, given the pending restructuring, and asked him to confirm in writing what I should prioritize. He didn't respond for 3 hours. By mid-morning, our logistics coordinator, a sharp 28-year-old named Tara Singh who'd been with us 4 years, appeared at my desk looking confused. "Hey Daniel, Janet Ochoa's office called about the February allocation update. She's asking if we have the revised projections yet." I had those projections. They were 80% done, sitting in a folder on my desktop. I also knew that Marcus had assigned the St. Vincent account to himself as part of the modernization transition. "You'll want to check with Marcus on that," I said. "He's taken point on the St. Vincent relationship." Tara blinked. "He has. As of the restructuring, yes." She stood there for a moment, like she was waiting for me to laugh. I smiled pleasantly and went back to my screen. I spent that morning updating compliance documentation, genuinely, legitimately my assigned responsibility, and filling out a formal change request for a vendor renewal that normally I'd have handled with a 3-minute phone call. The change request required sign-off from 2 managers and had a 5-business-day processing window. I submitted it at 10:47 a.m. By day 3, the first cracks appeared. Marcus had tried to reach Janet Ochoa twice. She'd responded to neither message. Janet was not a difficult person. She was, in fact, one of the warmest people I'd worked with in my career. But she ran a procurement department for 12 hospitals, and she had neither the time nor the patience to build a new relationship from scratch with a VP who didn't know her systems. What she did have was my cell phone number, which she'd had for 4 years. She used it. "Daniel, I'm not getting responses. We have a compliance audit in 6 weeks, and I need the updated documentation package. Is everything okay over there?" I told her there had been some internal restructuring and that Marcus Elliott was now her primary point of contact. I gave her his direct number. There was a pause. "The MBA kid?" she said. I said nothing. Another pause. "Okay," she said in the tone of someone who has made a decision. "I'm going to need you to know that if this situation doesn't stabilize, I have to start the vendor review process. That's not a threat, it's just my job." I told her I understood completely, that I hoped the transition would go smoothly, and that I was still with the company and available within my current responsibilities. I hung up and went to get coffee. What I hadn't mentioned to Marcus, because nobody had thought to ask, was that I was the only person at Hargrove who fully understood the St. Vincent compliance documentation system. It wasn't complicated once you knew it, but it evolved over 6 years through a series of regulatory updates in Janet's team's specific requirements, and all of that institutional memory lived in my head and in a series of annotated folders that only I knew how to navigate. I had offered twice to train a backup. Both times the request had been deprioritized. I documented those offers in writing, emails with timestamps. By the end of week 2, Marcus called me into his office. He looked like he hadn't slept well. There was a coffee stain on his tie that he hadn't noticed. I need you to walk me through the St. Vincent documentation system, he said. Of course, I said. I'd be glad to. Could you send me a formal request through the ops channel? Given the transition, I want to make sure I'm working within my proper scope. He stared at me. You want me to submit a ticket, just for documentation purposes. You understand. The muscle in his jaw moved. Daniel, Marcus, I said, I am genuinely trying to be helpful here. I want to make sure there's a clear record of what I am doing during this transition, so there are no misunderstandings about scope. I paused. I'm sure you understand the importance of documentation. He submitted the ticket at 4:15 p.m. I had a 5-business-day processing window. Week 3 was when Robert called me directly. I'd been expecting it. What I hadn't expected was for him to call on a Saturday morning, which meant he'd gotten to the point where he was working weekends on something that shouldn't have required it. Daniel? It's Robert. I wanted to talk man to man. I stepped out onto my back porch. The yard needed raking. Of course, Robert. The St. Vincent situation is getting complicated. He paused. Janet Ochoa called me personally. Told me she's initiating a vendor review. I'm sorry to hear that. She said she'd been trying to reach our team without success. I understand Marcus has been working on building that relationship. Another pause, longer. Daniel, I owe you a direct conversation. Marcus's plan, the restructuring, the senior advisor position. I signed off on it. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But I don't think we fully accounted for what a transition like that would actually mean in practice. In 22 years of work, I had learned that when someone says they didn't fully account for something, they're working their way toward an ask. I waited. The seed. Vincent contract is $24 million a year, Robert said. If we lose it, we lose our preferred vendor status with 2 of the 3 hospital networks we service. That's not a recovery situation. That's a different company. I understand. What would it take to fix this? I had thought about this conversation carefully, not vindictively. I want to be clear about that. I'd thought about it the way I used to think about logistics problems in the Army. What is the actual objective? What resources are available? And what outcome serves everyone's legitimate interests? I need a real title, I said. Not senior advisor, not interim anything. VP of Supply Chain Operations, reporting to you, not to Marcus. I need authority to implement process improvements rather than just recommend them. And I need a compensation review. I've been at the same salary for 3 years, and I'm aware of what comparable roles pay in this market. Robert was quiet for a moment. What's comparable in this market? For my scope? 170 to 200,000 base. I'm at 140. Another pause. That's significant. It's accurate, I said. You can verify it. What about Marcus? This was the part I'd thought about most. Marcus has real skills. He's good with clients in a first meeting context. He understands the business side in ways I don't have interest in. If you restructure so that we have clear lanes, he handles growth strategy and new business. I handle operations and existing accounts. I think that works. I'm not asking you to choose between us. Robert exhaled slowly. You could have made this a lot messier. That wouldn't have helped Carol, I said. Or Megan. Or, honestly, you. He asked me to come in Monday morning. I went inside, finished my coffee, and called Megan. She was 27 now, living in Seattle working for an environmental nonprofit that she was deeply passionate about and that paid her in something closer to meaning than money. We talked every Sunday, but I called her that Saturday because I needed to hear her voice. Dad, you sound weird. Good weird. What happened? I'll tell you when it's official, I said. Did you finally do something about that job situation? I'd mentioned the October meeting to her in vague terms. Megan had immediately told me to quit and offered to help cover Carol's prescriptions if I needed time to find something else. I told her absolutely not, and she'd said, Dad, I swear to God, and we left it there. Something like that, I said. Good, she said. You've been keeping that place together for years. If they can't see that, they can now, I said. Monday morning, I was in Robert's office at 8. He had the offer in writing. VP of Supply Chain Operations, $185,000 base, plus a performance bonus structure tied to contract retention metrics, reporting directly to him. Marcus's role is being redefined toward business development. There would be no formal announcement framing it as a demotion. Robert asked for that as a personal courtesy, and I agreed. Marcus was his son-in-law. I wasn't going to make Robert's Thanksgiving table into a casualty of my contract negotiation. What I did ask for, and got, was authorization to hire a backup on the St. Vincent account immediately, and a standing policy that any institutional knowledge critical to major accounts had to be formally documented and cross-trained within 90 days. I wanted this in writing specifically so that no future version of myself could be put in the position I'd just been in. Tara Singh got a title bump and a raise for being the one who'd kept asking the right questions during the chaos. She deserved both. I called Janet Ochoa that afternoon. She picked up on the first ring. "Tell me something good," she said. "The February projections are ready," I said, "and the compliance documentation package will be in your hands by Thursday. Also, I'm not going anywhere." "Thank God," she said. I could hear her actually exhale. "Daniel, I want you to know I didn't want to make that call to Robert, but I couldn't just—" "You did exactly the right thing," I said. "It's your job. How bad was it over there?" "It's fine now," I said. "That's the only part that matters." 6 months later, Carol and I took our first real vacation in 4 years. 10 days in the Smoky Mountains, a cabin with a porch where I drank coffee every morning, and watched the fog sit in the valleys and thought about nothing requiring a spreadsheet. Carol had found a new medication protocol that was helping. She hiked 2 miles one afternoon. Not fast, not easy, but she did it. And when we got back to the cabin, she sat on the porch steps and looked at me with the expression I'd fallen in love with 30 years ago. "You seem lighter," she said. "I feel it," I said. The St. Vincent contract renewed at a 15% increase. We added 2 new hospital network clients in Q2. The vendor management platform Marcus had recommended was quietly shelved after I demonstrated in a 40-minute presentation that it would create 3 new compliance risks and solve exactly one problem we didn't actually have. Marcus sat in the back of that meeting and said nothing. And afterward, he stopped by my office and said, "Good presentation," in the tone of someone who had learned something about choosing their battles. "Thanks," I said. "I thought your Q3 pipeline numbers looked strong." He blinked, like he hadn't expected that. "They do. Janet Ochoa's network referred 2 new systems our way." "Janet's good people," I said. He nodded and left, and that was probably the most honest conversation we'd had. Megan came home for Thanksgiving that year and sat at the table next to Carol, and at some point after the pie, she looked at me across the table and said, "You look like yourself again, Dad." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just said, "Pass the coffee." But she was right. I did. Some people spend years making themselves indispensable because they're hoping someone will finally notice. I was one of those people. What I eventually learned is that being indispensable is only useful if you're willing to let the people who undervalue you feel what it actually costs to do so. Not out of cruelty, but out of honesty. The moment I stopped doing more than I was asked to do, the real value of what I'd been doing became visible in a way that a decade of diligence never had. I didn't blow anything up. I just stopped holding it together for free. I think about that Saturday morning in my driveway a lot, sitting there in the dark with the engine off, not ready to walk inside yet, trying to figure out how 22 years of work had come down to a 31-year-old with a bad MBA telling me my thinking was outdated. That feeling, the specific, quiet humiliation of it, doesn't go away fast. I won't pretend it does. But here's what I've come to understand about that moment. What happened to me wasn't random. It followed a logic I've been participating in for years without realizing it. Every morning I came in at 6 instead of 8. I was teaching the company that my time had no real boundary. Every problem I solved before it became visible to anyone else, I was making my own contributions invisible. Every time I absorbed someone else's failure quietly and kept the machine running, I was confirming that the machine ran itself. The consequences I eventually experienced were the direct result of choices I had made. Not bad choices, not shameful ones, but choices I'd made without fully understanding what they were costing me. That's not self-blame. That's just cause and effect, and once I saw it clearly, I could work with it. What carried me through wasn't anger. Anger would have had me saying things in that October meeting that I couldn't unsay. What carried me through was something steadier, a kind of quiet confidence that I knew things that mattered, that those things had real value, and that the situation would eventually make that undeniable if I simply stopped subsidizing the people who were pretending otherwise. That took discipline. Not the dramatic kind. The boring kind, the kind that shows up as filling out a maintenance ticket instead of grabbing your tools, as sending one polite email asking for scope clarification instead of just doing the work. Small, consistent, unremarkable acts of holding a line. And then there was the choice at the end, the one Robert didn't expect, and honestly the one I'm most at peace with. I could have asked him to move Marcus out. I had the leverage. But I knew what that would have meant for Robert, for Priya, for the family dinner table dynamic that had nothing to do with me, and everything to do with people I didn't need to hurt. Choosing not to use every bit of power you've earned. That's not weakness. That's the difference between winning and being worth something. Marcus and I aren't close, but we work. And I can live with that. Carol hiked 2 miles in the Smokies 6 months after all of this resolved. 2 miles doesn't sound like much, unless you know what the last few years have looked like for her, in which case, it sounds like everything. Megan called me yourself again at Thanksgiving, and I didn't know how to respond because I hadn't realized I'd been someone else for a while. What I'd do differently, if I could go back, is simple. I would have drawn the line sooner, not out of selfishness, but out of honesty, because every extra hour I gave without acknowledgement wasn't generosity. It was a miscommunication I was allowing to continue. The people who undervalued me weren't entirely wrong to do so, because I'd never made the cost of my value risible. I fixed that. Took me too long, but I fixed it. You already know what you're worth. The question is whether you're willing to let the people around you feel what it actually costs when they pretend otherwise.